Today we're talking all about the big mistakes that many runners make on marathon race day. So I'm not really talking about mistakes you might make in your training or in your preparation in the weeks leading up to your marathon. I'm really talking about things that people do on race day itself that have a negative impact on your marathon result. So guys, I've got 4 big mistakes I want to get through. I've really ordered them in terms of severity, with the last one probably being the most common and the one that's most likely to impact your race experience the most. So you want to stay tuned for that one. Okay, so big mistake number 1 that many runners make on marathon day is they decide to try out new gear. So this might be your running shoes, socks, shorts, a running pack, whatever it might be. You don't want to turn up to the start line of your marathon with something that you haven't at least tested before. And basically the reason for that is you don't quite know how it's going to work or how it's going to sit after 1, 2, 3 hours of running. Running shorts is a good example. You don't want to turn up to your marathon with a brand new pair of running shorts because you never know, maybe they're going to chafe in some way that you never expected and that you never experienced before, and that can ruin your marathon experience. Same goes for your running shirt. Same goes for your running pack or anything you might use to carry stuff during your marathon. If you haven't trained with it, you definitely want to check it out before race day. So what I generally recommend, guys, is that in a few of the long runs leading up to your marathon race, you do basically a dress rehearsal where you wear everything you're going to run on marathon day and you take everything that you're planning to take on marathon day. So if you're planning to run with a pack or a waist belt or whatever, and you want to have water and gels and stuff, try and replicate that in a sort of dress rehearsal in one of your long runs, at least one, before marathon day. The thing is that with a lot of these things, you often encounter issues that only crop up after running for like 2 hours. So maybe you've got a running pack that you've always thought is fine for short runs, and you don't realize that it really starts to irritate you, it starts to rub after 2 or 3 hours of running. And the only way you can find that out is by going for a long run with the gear. The second thing to note about new gear is you definitely don't want to run a marathon with a brand new pair of running shoes. Reason is every single pair of running shoes needs to be broken in. When they're fresh out the box, they're maybe a bit stiff and they haven't found their form yet. You need to break them in with probably about 30 miles of running before I would recommend taking them on like a marathon style event. The flip side is you don't want to be running a marathon with a super old pair of shoes. So once you've got like 200 miles in a pair of shoes, they usually start to lose a bit of their spring, a bit of their support. So somewhere around that 30 mile to roughly 200 mile mark is how old your shoes should be when you go for a marathon. Right, the second big mistake that many runners make on marathon race day is that they don't have a nutrition strategy. And by nutrition strategy, I mean they don't have a plan for what they're going to eat actually before the marathon or during the marathon. This can be a big problem because marathons are really all about fueling. They're all about having enough fuel to get you to the end, to the 26.2 mile mark. And it's especially important for those last 10 miles or so. That's usually when people run out of glycogen and they hit the wall. So guys, one thing you want to be aware of is carb loading. You want to be increasing your carbohydrate intake for 2 or 3 days before your marathon, especially the evening before your marathon. You don't want to have a huge meal, but you want to have a generous sized meal that is more carb dense than what you're used to. The same goes for when you wake up the morning of your marathon. You want to be having a breakfast that is going to be helping fuel you, but you don't want to be having something that's going to overwhelm your stomach just before you go and try and run 26.2 miles. So for that reason, again, you want to think about carbs, but very importantly, it needs to be something that you've tested in training. It needs to be something that you know you're going to be able to eat, that you know you can eat before a long run without it coming back and repeating on you or giving you issues. And the second part of a good nutrition strategy is what you're going to be eating actually during your race, during the 26.2 miles. So this is another funny one because a lot of people who line up, especially with your first marathon, a lot of people line up for the marathon and maybe in training, they've only done a couple of really long runs. Maybe they're used to doing 5Ks, 10Ks, and they've done a couple of half marathons. And in those distance of races, you can kind of get off without worrying too much about fueling while you run, but once you get into running 26.2 miles, you really need to be topping up your glycogen reserves as you're running. Otherwise, you're going to run out and you're going to hit the wall and you're going to struggle. The big thing you want to be aware of when you're planning your nutrition strategy while you're running is make sure that you're planning to eat something that is actually compatible with your stomach. When we go for long distance runs that last for a few hours, the body actually diverts blood flow away from the stomach, so shuts down the stomach operating system basically, which can lead to gastrointestinal distress, which is not something you really want during a marathon, but it's something that everybody suffers from to some extent. So that's why it's really important that you have a tested nutrition strategy in place before you even start your marathon. You want to know what you're going to be eating and how frequently you're going to be eating it before you start your marathon. So again, it comes down to those dress rehearsals. It comes down to those long runs in the weeks leading up to your marathon. This is when you get to test out different things. Guys, for me, like a lot of runners, I basically rely on energy gels. So these maybe aren't the healthiest, but they're specifically designed for endurance sports, for things exactly like marathons. They're designed to get the energy through your digestive system as efficiently and quickly as possible. These ones are GUs, they're standard issue. They're designed to be taken every 45 minutes during exercise. So I basically just follow the instructions. I take one at the start line, then every 45 minutes of my race, I take another one. The big issue with energy gels is that some people don't like them, or maybe you could say some people's stomach don't like them. So they do taste really cloying and synthetically sweet. It's not something I really enjoy taking, but I take it because I know it's good for my performance. And it's something that I actually don't have any issues taking. However, a lot of people do. A lot of people can maybe have 1 or 2 gels, but then if they go for a long run and they have 3 or 4, then they start to get gastrointestinal issues. So if you're planning to run your marathon on gels, you definitely want to do a few of those long runs using the same fueling strategy before your actual race. So if you decide that gels aren't for you, you definitely want to identify and test an alternative before race day. A lot of people go down the whole foods route. They stick to things like bananas and trail mix and things like that. That doesn't deliver quite as much of an energy punch as gels do, but it works. One final point on race day nutrition, guys, is that during your marathon, there's probably going to be a bunch of aid stations that have got all kinds of different snacks. Maybe chocolate, maybe fruit, whatever. Just a word of warning that all this stuff works differently for different people. Some things give different runners different stomach issues, you can never tell. So in general, if you're not sure, I would just avoid that stuff. You don't want to be at the halfway point and grab a banana thinking it's going to help you, and then it ends up giving you stomach cramps and affecting your race. Now, the third big mistake that many runners make on marathon day is not planning their race day logistics. So when I talk about race day logistics, I'm really talking about everything you do before your marathon leading up to the start line, and then stuff immediately afterwards. But really, the important stuff to get right is everything before your marathon. So big mistakes people make is they don't prepare things the night before. They don't plan what they're going to eat when they get up. They don't have their journey from wherever they're sleeping, whether it's a hotel or their house, to the start of the marathon well mapped out, or really thinking about their timing. So they arrive at the start line with little time to do whatever kind of registration process is required, maybe drop off their drop bag or go to the toilet. That's basically mandatory, even if you don't think you need it when you leave home. By the time you get to the start line, you're going to be feeling a bit nervous. You almost definitely will need to go to the toilet, and you want to time that toilet visit for as soon as you can before the race actually starts without compromising actually getting to the start line. You also want to factor in a little bit of time there for warming up. So you don't want the first running you do that day to be when you cross the start line of your marathon. You want to warm up a bit with some light, simple jogging, maybe 15 to 20 minutes before the race actually starts, just to get the blood flowing, just to activate your muscles. Then you got to be aware of where you should be when the race starts. This is a big mistake that many people make, especially in their first marathon, and especially in big city marathons where everybody's segregated into different sections based on your expected performance. You want to have a really good idea where you're supposed to be and when well in advance of actually turning up to your start line. That way you arrive with plenty of time, you can warm up, you can go to the toilet, you can find where you're supposed to be, you can have your pre-race gel or whatever you might want to eat, you can make sure your GPS is ready to go, and then you're in the zone. What you find happens so much is that there's kind of a chaos at the start line of any race really, where people think they arrive in enough time, but then the adrenaline of the race gets on top of them, you might get lost, you might get a bit disorientated, and you end up forgetting to, you know, eat the gel or start your GPS watch, or you end up in the wrong place, and next thing you know, the starting pistol goes and you've got to start running. So it sounds kind of basic, right? But my advice is well in advance of your marathon, map out what that day looks like from the moment you wake up until the start line, and then also afterwards, so after your race, where are you gonna go, how are you gonna get home, all that stuff. You wanna have all that stuff mapped out in advance. It means you're gonna have a relaxed start to your race, and it means that morning of your race you're not gonna be stressed. It means the night before you're gonna get a good rest because you're not gonna be thinking through in your head, what happens here, what happens there. You basically visualize it, you run through it in your head and you're prepared. Okay, so mistake number 4, it's easily the biggest mistake and the most common mistake I see marathon runners make. And it's that they basically screw up their marathon pace by going out too fast. They run too fast from the start line, and it ends up coming and biting them in the ass later on in the race. They end up hitting the wall, their legs freeze up, they run out of fuel, maybe they get injured, and they really suffer throughout the rest of their race. Most of them will finish, but they'll end up walking for at least the last 6 or 7 miles. You don't want that to happen to you. So basically, how do you screw up your marathon pace? There are 2 ways most people screw up their marathon pace. One is that they don't have any kind of plan. They just turn up and decide to wing it and see how they get on. And 2 is that they have a plan, but when they start their race, they kind of get swept up in the adrenaline of the start line and they feel great, so they go out faster than what they intended, and then it kind of comes back to bite you in the ass later on. If you start a marathon without any kind of target pace in mind, there's a good chance you're going to be going out too fast. And the reason is your body's rested, you've been preparing for this for months, your body's ready to go and perform, you've been carb loading, you're loaded up with energy, and also you've got the adrenaline of race day there. So it's very likely that when you cross the start line, you're going to find it super easy to run much faster than what you otherwise would. And then you're probably going to feel good and be able to maintain that for probably like the first hour. Then you'll start to slow down a bit. It's not until the last hour or the last 6 miles or so that you're really going to suffer, and it's kind of going to compound and come back and bite you in the ass. So what happens when we go out too fast? A few things can happen. Basically, you're exerting your muscles harder than what you've trained them for and harder than you need to be. You're also just putting more strain on your system than you need to be, cardiovascular system, muscular system. And third is that if you're really pushing hard, you burn through your glycogen reserves, that's the stored fuel in your body, much faster, and you're gonna drain that down to 0, and then you're gonna bonk, you're gonna hit the wall. So what happens? You hit the wall, you run out of energy altogether, maybe your legs lock up, you'll basically feel like every step is tough, every step's a challenge, you won't be able to run, it'll be super uncomfortable, you'll just be walking, and you'll really want to quit. It's happened to me, it's not pleasant, I now avoid it at all costs. How do you avoid this? Basically, when you arrive at the start line of your marathon, you need to have a target race pace in mind. And if in doubt, you want to be conservative. If this is your first marathon and you haven't really been training for any kind of speed, my recommendation is you aim to run at a comfortable conversational pace throughout the whole marathon. That's a pace at which you could maintain a conversation with somebody running next to you. Guys, I'm going to link below to my video all about marathon pace. To me, it's the biggest thing people screw up on marathons. It's completely unnecessary, and it's something that if you dial it in and you can run an even pace, you're going to have a great race. You're going to start and finish feeling good. You're going to get through your 26.2 miles, and you're going to do it at a speed that's achievable for you, and you're going to be happy with the result you get at the finish line. So guys, those are my 4 big mistakes that people make during the marathon. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. Likewise, you can subscribe below and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever I add another one of these videos. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.